I don't want you to feel like it's two different services. This is one service. Because I'm trying not to shut the door on people who join electronically. I'm having to treat it almost like two different ones because I have to do that side in two different steps. But if you want to take your hymnals then and be turning to page 474, page 474. Let's all stand and sing together. We're going to sing Only a Sinner. Page 474. Not have I gotten, but what I receive. Grace has bestowed it since I had believed. Boasting excluded, pride I abase. I'm only a sinner, saved by grace. Only a sinner, saved by grace. Only a sinner, saved by grace. This is my story, to God be glory. I'm only a sinner, saved by grace. Once I was foolish and sin ruled my heart, causing my footsteps from God to depart. Jesus had found me, had me by grace. I now am a sinner, saved by grace. Only a sinner, saved by grace. Only a sinner, saved by grace. This is my story, to God be glory. I'm only a sinner, saved by grace. Tears unavailing, no merit had I. Mercy had saved me, or else I must die. Sin had alarmed me, fearing was raised, but now I'm a sinner, saved by grace. Only a sinner, saved by grace. Only a sinner, saved by grace. This is my story, to God be glory. I'm only a sinner, saved by grace. Suffer a sinner whose heart overflows, loving his Savior to tell what he knows. Once more to tell it what I embrace. I'm only a sinner, saved by grace. Only a sinner, saved by grace. Only a sinner, saved by grace. This is my story, to God be glory. I'm only a sinner, saved by grace. All right, Giovanni, you open us with a word of prayer.
Dear Father, thank you for bringing us here together. And I pray that you open our minds and our hearts, that we may hear the words that our pastor is going to preach, that we may understand it, and that it may draw us closer to you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen. All right, let's turn over to page 436. Bring them in. Page 436. Bring them in. What is the shepherd's voice I hear out in the desert dark and clear, calling the sheep who've gone astray, far from the shepherd's fold away. Bring them in, bring them in.
Bring them in from the fields of sin. Bring them in, bring them in. Bring the wandering ones to Jesus. Go and help this shepherd's kind. Help him the wandering ones to find. Who will bring the lost ones to the fold, when they'll be sheltered from the cold. Bring them in, bring them in, bring them in from the fields of sin. Bring them in, bring them in, bring the wandering ones to Jesus. Out in the desert here they roam, out on the mountains wild and high. Heart is the Master speaks to thee. Go find my sheep wherever they be. Bring them in, bring them in, bring them in from the fields of sin. Bring them in, bring them in, bring the wandering ones to Jesus.
All right, you can be seated. I appreciate you being out tonight in the service. We're going to be turning to the book of Joshua. All right, Joshua and chapter number 11. I had what I gave to Stefania, so if he gave them all out, then no. All the bulletins, you give them all out? Or? All right, there's one there left. All right, Joshua chapter 11, we finally finished Joshua 10, but Joshua 11, on the other hand, we're going to do all at once. So Joshua chapter number 11, I'm just going to take a few thoughts from this chapter and try to build on them. And so we're going to begin by reading verses 1 through 5. It says, "And it came to pass when Jabin, king of Hazor, had heard those things, that he sent to Joab, king of Madon, the king of Shimron, the king of Akshaph, to the kings that were on the north of the mountains." I tell you what, Lordy, if you can sit next to Lordy Donna for a little while. Giovanni's got to leave early. You can have his seat, and Eli, you can be back where you were. Musical chairs. I'm really good at puzzles. We're good to go. You can have that one in the middle. All right, so back to where I was at. "And to the Canaanite on the east and on the west, and to the Amorite, and to the Hittite, and the Perizzite, and the Jebusite, and the mountains, and to the Hivite under Hermon in the land of Mizpah. And they went out, they and all their hosts with them, much people, even as the sand that is upon the seashore in multitude, with horses and chariots very many. And when all the kings were met together, they came and pitched together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel." If you think that's impressive, negotiating all the seats that fast, you should have been here any time on Sunday when I was having to do 3 services, and I had to specifically set everybody here and there to make sure everybody was happy. Every service was a puzzle in and of itself. All right, looking at this passage, what I want to take away from this and what I want to build in this message is the importance of not being overwhelmed. This passage is not too different than what happened in chapter 10. In chapter 10, though, you have 5 kings and their armies coming against Israel. The size of those armies doesn't have a tremendous emphasis on it. The main emphasis is that you have these 5 kings lining up against them and the Gibeonites. However, in this chapter, the size of the problem is the emphasis. The emphasis here is not that the world is coming against you and you have enemies working against you, but that the issue here is that when the enemies are all accumulated, when all your problems are put in one place, there is the sand of the sea. That's the issue in chapter 11. That's why I've said from the beginning that Joshua gives you a beautiful understanding of what it means for you and I to have to grow as Christians and overcome certain problems that hinder us in our spiritual life, in our faith and walk with God and so forth, is because every chapter is a new adventure. Now, admittedly, we're getting into those chapters that are the exact reason why I'm not doing a verse-by-verse Bible study of Joshua. Not right now. There is a time in our church's history where we'll do that probably. But for right now, I don't want to spend weeks explaining to you why it's so important to know who was here and who was there and this happened and that happened in regards to dividing up the land. Now, again, that's very important, but our church is still, let's say, a baby church, 3 years old. That's not the deep level of information we want to get in right now. We want to get the highlights so that you can get the information from that. So that's why actually from here, we're going to skip all the way on next Wednesday night. We'll be all the way over in chapter 14, because I'm not going to get you tied up in the dividing of the land after this. But by doing it this way, by coming in and picking up these highlights, it allows us to see some of the things that we as Christians struggle with as we grow in Christ, and just especially as we're coming as, let's say, immature Christians, or even as you grow, these things are still true, that you have to struggle with to keep from losing some of the strength you have spiritually, to keep from being defeated spiritually, to keep from walking around and feeling like you don't know how to face tomorrow and that kind of stuff. And so, of course, it's natural that at some point the problem you're going to deal with is the problem of being overwhelmed. Because a lot of these things at some point should cease to be problems. They should be things that you've got this settled, I can move on, and I can fight the next battle. But the issue of being overwhelmed always comes back. I laugh at it right now. Maybe if I was in that period of time, I wouldn't feel this way. But it seems like for me in ministry, it's always about once a year that the devil spends a year setting up all of his pieces and getting them in place. And then he hits me with everything he can in one day. Now, the first year I was here as pastor, he did that. And a lot of y'all know that story of how he did it. And it did overwhelm me. I went to my office that Sunday evening after the service was done, after I'd been hit from every angle I thought I could. I sat down and I had a guy who I had been giving the gospel to him, sitting down, counseling with him on a regular basis, at least once a week in my office, pouring my heart and soul into him. And he calls me up, and he had walked out of the service that night, and I didn't think nothing of it because he was normal for him to just leave at times. And then he calls me and tells me, "Preacher, I'm not coming back anymore if you don't stop preaching the whole Bible. I want you to only preach parts of it because it's not all true." And so, of course, at that point, I'd had enough. And so I just told him, said, "Look, I'm not going to stop preaching the Bible for anybody, much less you. So if you're not going to listen to the Word of God and you're not going to receive it, then you can go. It's not a problem." But then the next day, I got hit by something else and something else, to where it was about 2 days there. For the whole day on Monday, I sat in my office and I just did not want to deal with it. I didn't want to talk to anybody. I knew it wasn't good to be around my family. So I just stayed in my office. I didn't talk to anybody. The next year, when that same wave come at the same exact time of the year, both times it was right at Easter. So this next time, Easter again, it comes, and this one's calling me with this problem, and this one with this problem, and this one with this problem, and it's all trying to stack up. The next time it was a little bit easier, but that didn't stop it from coming back. And here we are finishing up the third year, and this time the devil, I don't know if he gave up or if he just got lazy, because he didn't put many pieces together with his attack this time. He did it, but he didn't hit as hard this time. Either that or I got a little bit stronger, so I didn't feel it as much. I don't know. But my point is, the issue with being overwhelmed and having those times where you just don't want to talk, you just want to go sit down and be alone, it's not unusual. You see that in the Bible. Some of the greatest men in the Bible are examples of that, even to the point where they asked God to kill them. I mean, you may not think about that, but Moses actually was overwhelmed because, and admittedly, Moses had more of a right to be overwhelmed than you and I do. Moses was overwhelmed because he was trying to care for the needs of, let's say, 1 million people. He had an entire nation he was taking care of. And at that point in time, he had not set up a good system of government where there was people between him and the other people. And that's why even with the small church we have and the small group where, let's say, the reach of our church of people I have to worry with and deal with, or let's say around 100 people, even with that, I still delegate certain people to other people and let them deal with it. And I only take care of the big problems. That's why when Reza has little problems, I let Eli take care of it. or let all the Romanians just let Lord take care of it. No, but my point is, I learned a lesson from Moses. I didn't want to get overwhelmed, so I started that early. That I'll let, okay, I have people who I trust you to deal with certain things, so I don't have to deal with all of it. But Moses got so overwhelmed. Even his father-in-law, who wasn't a believer, told him, Moses, you're taking too much. You don't have enough help. You have Aaron and your sister. You need to do something else. But Moses got so overwhelmed, he asked God to kill him. He asked God to take me out of this because I cannot bear it anymore. Now, to show you the opposite extreme of that, though, because this is a man, Moses had probably a right to be overwhelmed. I mean, I can tell you as a pastor, when you have 100 people to deal with who are remotely your responsibility compared to 1 million people that are entirely your responsibility, if I can get overwhelmed with that, what I have, for sure, he had every right to be overwhelmed with what he was dealing with. I completely understand how he would get there. But the opposite extreme of that is Jonah. Jonah got upset to the point and overwhelmed to the point where he asked God to kill him for what you and I would consider to be a babyish reason. Jonah, after experiencing the greatest revival in human history that I know of, an entire city, the capital city of one of the most wicked empires that ever existed, all turned to God, weeping and mourning with sackcloth and ashes and every form of repentance they could express, to the point that God himself said, okay, I'm not going to destroy you anymore. I mean, God changed his mind about destroying these people. That's how great the revival was that swept through the city of Nineveh. Nineveh being, again, the capital of the Syrians, the capital of the arch enemies of Israel, the capital of one of the most wicked empires. When you've heard me talk about those people who would take a small child like my daughter, her age, and in order to test, because this is what they thought was interesting, they liked to perfect the art of torture. They would take a child around that age, and I'm not using her just because she's the one here, I'm using her because it's around that age, and they would peel layers of flesh off of that child, one by one, until they would see how many it took before the shock and the pain of that was enough to kill them. They would take a grown man and they would cut his side open, and they would begin to reach inside of him and pull out organs and see which organs they could take out without killing him. Not immediately, at least. They wanted to find out which ones they could take, which ones they could rip out that would cause a slower death. That's the kind of stuff that they did as an empire. They sacrificed children. They did all these kind of things, every evil and abominable thing you could imagine. So I will say this. I understand why Jonah hated them. Why there was a part of him that wanted God to wipe them out. But then when Jonah sees this great revival, that's why he didn't go to Nineveh in the first place. And I know you didn't come here for a message on Jonah, but that's why he didn't go to Nineveh. Was because he didn't want Nineveh to be saved. If God said, okay, I'm going to destroy them, he said, praise the Lord, destroy them. But that wasn't what God had in mind. He was sending him to Nineveh for a purpose. God obviously knew what would happen when Jonah got there. So Jonah, on the other hand, gets mad when it happens. He goes, he sits under a tree outside of the city, and he begins to pout and cry and say, poor me, because people actually listened to his message and turned to God because of something he preached. I mean, can you imagine a preacher getting mad because somebody actually listened to him? I would praise God if somebody actually listened to anything that I say. But he's over there crying under a tree because of it. To the point where he starts crying because, and get this is where it really gets to what I call babyish. Because all of his problems were small problems in his own mind. A gourd had grew over top of his head that was providing him shade. And when it dried up and died, he got mad at God because, God, why are you against me? Because his shade disappeared from his shade tree. That was his reason that he finally broke. That was the straw that broke the camel's back, as we would say, that caused Jonah to say, God, just kill me. If you don't love me any more than this, just kill me and get me out of here. But the thing is, I'm giving you those two because they are opposite extremes, but it shows you how easy it is to get overwhelmed. It shows you how easy it is for us to take things that sometimes the stuff that overwhelms you right now, that right now it feels like it's too much, I cannot bear this. If I have one more problem, I'm giving up. If one more problem, I'll be like Eli and say I should kill myself. Well, the things that cause that right now, sometimes they're justified. Sometimes you really are bearing about all you probably can bear. And that's true. And it's probably right that you feel some of the loads you do. But you still don't have to be overwhelmed. But the other side of that is sometimes the things that are overwhelming us, to be honest with you, it's childish that we're bothered by it. It's childish that this is the thing. It goes back to the message I preached some time back about if the footmen have wearied you. If running against a man on foot wearied you, then what are you going to do when the chariots come and you have to run against the horses? Sometimes the problems that are wearying us are children's problems. It's child's play. We should be well beyond that at this point. It doesn't change the point, though, that these things have a real impact on us, and that sometimes the little foxes do spoil the grapes. Sometimes it's the flies in the ointment that do cause the rot. That sometimes little things do add up. And again, even these are not your only examples. You find David also doing this and Elijah doing this. David doesn't necessarily ask God to kill him, but David gets so overwhelmed on multiple occasions that he just cannot bear it anymore. At one point, David goes and joins his enemy because of the fact that he's just overwhelmed with running from Saul. David actually becomes the bad guy for a little while. We forget that part of the story. We don't really read about it and understand what all that means, but David went and joined the Philistines for a little while because he got tired of how hard his problems were when he was keeping his integrity and running from Saul. Elijah, you see him, he's kind of in the middle of Moses and with Jonah, because his story is actually a lot similar to a lot closer to Jonah, but he had some real problems. And by that, what I mean is this. Elijah had just experienced one of the greatest events that anybody could ever imagine. He's on Mount Carmel. He's brought the 400 or 500 or however many prophets of Baal together, and they've issued the challenge to determine whose God is the real God. They build the altar. They call out for their God. You know the story. The prophets of Baal cut themselves. They dance around from morning till evening trying to get their God to do something, to send down fire and consume the sacrifice. Nothing happens. Elijah steps up. Elijah, to me, he doesn't get enough credit in terms of being the guy who's somewhat sarcastic, even a little bit arrogant at times. We put that on some of the other people who aren't so much that way. Elijah really was. In order to prove his point that his God is the real God, he didn't just call on his God to send down fire from heaven. He dug a moat, a trench around that sacrifice, and poured bucket after bucket of water on top of it until it was all soaked and the ditch was full of water. And then he asked God to burn the sacrifice. And God sent down fire from heaven so powerful that not only was the sacrifice consumed, but everything, the altar, the water, it was all burned up. And the people of Israel turned against the prophets of Baal, killed them, and took a great stand that day. You think about that. Everything you could have ever wanted, everything you could have ever asked for, he got it. And then all of a sudden he hears that Jezebel, who you should have expected is going to be upset with you since she was the chief leader in this false religion, says that, Elijah, as the Lord liveth, by tomorrow I'm going to have your head cut off. And he goes running and he hides and he says, "Oh, poor me, God, if this is the way you're going to treat me, then it'd be better off you just kill me, take me out of this world." So admittedly, the queen of your kingdom is trying to find you and cut your head off. But on the alternative side of that, your God literally just brought down fire from heaven and proved himself to be the only one true and living God. So while he had real problems like Moses, he's still reacting in a way that is irrational like Jonah. So that even gives you three unique perspectives of people who get overwhelmed, that sometimes it's all legitimate. Sometimes it's a mixture of things, and sometimes it's not merited at all. But that doesn't change the fact that our problems do add up. So bringing this back to Joshua, it would be easy to see this as a perfect example of a Elijah story or Jonah if it got handled any differently than what it did. Now, the fact is, Joshua doesn't get overwhelmed. Joshua is now being met with the challenge. He just defeated his other enemies, sat down and rested for a little while, and he looks up and he has enemies lined up against him as the sands of the sea. It would be easy for Joshua to all of a sudden feel like it's too much. I can't handle all of this. We're tired. We've been fighting. And now this. I just wiped out all these other enemies, and now I have this to deal with. More, not even comparable to what I've been fighting. It says this is like the sand of the sea, all these enemies together. but Joshua did not get overwhelmed. That's the thing that separates Joshua from being on this list of people who got overwhelmed is not the events of what happened to him, it's how he reacted. Because the fact is, he had just as much right as Moses to have gotten overwhelmed. His story parallels a lot like Elijah. God just gave a great victory. I mean, literally the sun stood still and God rained down hell from heaven to defeat his enemies. So, you have a story very much like Elijah's. The only difference between him and Elijah is when Elijah got faced with a problem that was bigger than what he wanted to deal with, he asked God to kill him. Joshua did not. Moses, again, had real problems just like Joshua, but Joshua didn't ask God to kill me. I'm done with this. Just take me out of this world. Unlike Jonah, who had no reason to be in that situation, it was all emotional and all his own immaturity and struggles. Joshua never dealt with that issue here. I'm sure he dealt with the temptation. I'm sure he dealt with the struggle the same way everybody does, because we're human and that's what happens. But Joshua never gave into it. He wasn't overwhelmed. I mean, you think about this. I'm not talking to you about the kind of problems you and I deal with. I'm talking about you look up all of a sudden and your enemies have come against you. They're surrounded you and they are as the sand of the sea. They are innumerable. As far as you can see, there are enemies lined up to kill you, your family, and everything that you've ever cared about. And here you are, you have to go out and you have to fight that. It doesn't matter whether you're ready for it or not. It doesn't matter that you've just been fighting and fighting and fighting. It doesn't matter that literally, you just come out of a battle where God had to make the sun stand still, and for, let's say, more than 24 hours, or at least 24 hours, you have fought without ceasing. And then when that was done, you decided, I want to make sure I do what God wants me to do. So you go and you fight a few more enemies. And now that you finally have sat down and tried to rest, you look up and my problems are so many. There are so many of them. It's like the sand of the sea. Everywhere I look, there's a problem. As far as I can see, there's problems. To not be overwhelmed in that is an impressive feat. And it is something that you will struggle with throughout your Christian life. It doesn't matter how strong you are, how spiritual you are. There will be times where you have done a tremendous job. You've been here fighting, you've kept your guard up, you've had the shield in your hand, you've defeated enemy after enemy after enemy after enemy, but every once in a while something has gotten through and it's hit you. And that was too much, I can't take that. And then the next thing, whatever, the next attack hits you, and the next attack. And so little by little, the enemy's been chipping away at you and you didn't even realize it, to where you get overwhelmed. You just can't take it anymore, it's too much. And so looking at this passage, there is a tremendously important lesson about not being overwhelmed. That if we want to maintain our victory, we have to realize problems don't just disappear. We will have problems constantly coming back up. We'll always have to deal with these. And yes, sometimes it's going to look to you like your enemy is as the sand of the sea. Like there's no end in sight. That as far as I can see, I'm going to continue to have problem after problem after problem after problem. But if we will follow his example, and I'll try to give it to you quickly because I've used most of my time just setting up this principle. And to be honest with you, I've not touched a single verse in your verse list, so you may just have to take them home and appreciate them later. But looking at this, there are some important lessons we can learn. So the first thing, we've read through verse 4 and 5 where we talk about the enemies being as the sand of the sea. Let's read verse 6. It says, "And the Lord said unto Joshua, Be not afraid because of them. For tomorrow about this time I will deliver them up, all slain before Israel. Thou shalt hoe their horses and burn their chariots with fire." The thing that helped keep Joshua from getting overwhelmed was he put his faith and trust in God. He didn't get distracted by the enemy. He wasn't afraid of them because he kept his focus on the Lord. I mean, this is the difference between him and Elijah. You think about it. Elijah, why would you be afraid of Jezebel when God just proved, I mean, in the most literal possible way, God just proved that her God is fake and that he is the real God and just killed all of her false prophets, or at least the majority of them, and then all of a sudden she gets mad and says, I'm going to kill you. Why on earth would you be afraid of her? God already proved himself to you. Even for Moses, admittedly, his problems were huge, and it's proper and understandable why he would be overwhelmed to be dealing with that. But the fact is, God was already giving him advice of how to deal with this. God was already pushing him about what to do. He just had to slow down and listen. But even beyond that, who had actually been feeding the people? God was. Who actually was providing them with water? Well, God was. Who actually was taking care of every need they had? God was. Moses was dealing with the complaints, but if Moses really took to heart and understood what was going on, he would realize that God was taking care of all of this. I don't actually have to be afraid and worry the way that I am because it's not on me. Now, that's easier said than done, and I know that. It's a lot easier to say that than it is to live that. I know that from experience. I know that very well with my heart. But at the end of the day, it doesn't change the fact that it's still right. Just because something's not easy to do doesn't mean that it's the wrong advice. It's still the right advice, even if it's hard to put in practice. And so for Moses, the truth is he didn't have to get overwhelmed. He just had to keep his focus on God and realize God was taking care of the people. It wasn't his responsibility to feed them. It was God's. The same thing's true of Elijah. He had to realize that God delivered him on Mount Carmel. God can deliver him from Jezebel. And for Jonah, the answer is you just need to realize what God's doing and grow up and get over your own emotions. Because again, Jonah, I hate to be mean, Jonah's just being a baby. Jonah didn't want to see his enemy get saved, and he got offended when his enemy got saved. That is a sincere emotional problem that he needs to grow up from. But in these situations where I'm showing you people who got overwhelmed, even David admits of himself that the answer to fixing it when he got overwhelmed, and you read that multiple times throughout the Psalms, is by turning his eyes back on God. In fact, I'll give you at least one verse we'll get through tonight from your verse list, Psalm 142 and verse 3. This is singing about what happens when I'm overwhelmed. In verse 3, when my spirit was overwhelmed within me, then thou knewest my path. In the way wherein I walked, have they privily laid a snare for me, meaning they put a trap for me. I looked on my right hand and beheld, but there was no man that would know me. Refuge failed me, no man cared for my soul. I cried unto the Lord, I said, thou art my refuge and my portion in the land of the living. So what is the advice when you're overwhelmed by somebody who experienced this more than the average person? Because his problems were more, to be honest, they were bigger than most of our problems. David went through some problems that Shakespeare, soap operas, and all that stuff would take influence from because they're that big and hard to believe. So when you look at what he went through, his answer is when I am overwhelmed, when it's just too much for me, and I look around and realize that my enemies have set traps for me, I cannot navigate this on my own, and I look around and I realize that nobody's on my side, nobody's trying to help me, what will I do? I'll call to God because God is going to help me. So to be honest with you, I could divide this message up into multiple thoughts and ideas, but it really comes down to a simple thought, and that is to not be distracted by the enemy, but keep your focus on God. To not get so distracted by the problems. Because this is what we do. We get so busy looking at, I have this and this and this and this, and we forget that we have a God who's capable of doing exceedingly abundantly above all that we may ask or think. We forget that we have a God who's invited us to cast all our cares upon him because he cares for us. We forget that we have a God who's told us to come to him, all those who are weary and heavy laden, and he will give us rest. We forget that he's told us that if we wait upon the Lord, he will renew our strength. We have a God who's offered to bear us through, if not even fix all of our problems. And yet, instead of looking at him, we're looking at the problems. So while I do have a typical 2-point outline, I'm simplifying it to that the answer tonight to not being overwhelmed is to stop looking at the problems and start looking at God. Your rest is in him. Your distress is in the problems. You want to be distressed. You want to be overwhelmed. You want to be burdened. Then continue to look at the problems. Now, you don't have to be. I don't know how I do this. I always put 2 Corinthians chapter 4 on my outline or in my verse list, and I've always got the intention that we're going to put some focus on that. We're going to take some time to look at that passage and really understand it. And somehow, every time I write that on my verse list, that's the message where I don't even touch the verse list and I miss the message. So now we know the secret. If you don't want me to preach my outline, we put 2 Corinthians chapter 4 on my verse list. But the good news is we're going back to our study of 2 Corinthians, so I have to deal with it in the near future. But 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 8 says, we are troubled on every side, yet not distressed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Cast down, but not destroyed. For which cause we faint not. This dropping down to verse 16. He explains some in the middle about this as well, about actually a lot of what Stefani talked about last night, that we don't have to be overwhelmed when we're facing trials because we have eternity to look forward to. But that's where verse 16 explains it the best. That's why I dropped down to there. It says, for which cause we faint not, though our outward man perish, yet our inward man is renewed day by day. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. While we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. What he's saying in that passage is you may be being attacked from every side. I mean, that's what verse 8 says, you're troubled on every side. So how do you get overwhelmed? When your problems are hitting you from every side, when they're too big and they're too many. But he says we don't have to actually be distressed. That would be very close to being overwhelmed. I mean, distressed is when you start sending out the distress signal and you start calling for help because you feel like the problems are too much for you. So it's very similar, if not synonymous, to being overwhelmed. He says, even though you may feel like you're in a room and it's filling up with water and you've got about this much air left before you drown in your problems, you don't have to be distressed where you feel like it's time to give up and start waving the white flag. He says, even though you don't understand what all's going on, you are perplexed. That's what it means. You don't understand this. It doesn't make sense to me. You don't actually have to be in despair. You don't actually have to be at that place where, you've given up. I mean, that's what despair is, when you don't know what else to do and you're just, again, similar to the idea of being overwhelmed. That's why I've included it tonight. Even though you may be persecuted, you may have enemies lining up on every side. It feels like everybody's against you. He says you're still not forsaken, because we have a friend that sticketh closer than a brother. We have the Lord Jesus Christ. And then he says also you may feel like you're cast down. You may feel like you've been knocked down on the flat of your back, the wind is out of you, and you don't know how to get up and press on any further, but you are not defeated. That's the thing, is you may get knocked down sometimes. You may feel like you're being hit from every angle. You may feel like you don't know what's going on, and you may feel like everybody's against you. But if we really step back for a moment and stop looking at the problems and start looking at our God, then we can realize something. No matter how much I feel like I'm overwhelmed, I don't actually have to be in distress. No matter how perplexed I may be, I don't have to be in despair. No matter how persecuted I may feel, I don't have to feel like I've been forsaken. No matter how much I feel like I've been knocked down, I don't have to feel like I'm out of the fight, that I am defeated. The fact is, within the Christian life, if we would just get our focus back on God, that is the single most important thing you can do to keep from being overwhelmed. There's other thoughts in this passage. So let me try to give you verse 10 through 12. And Joshua at that time turned back and took Hazor and smote the king thereof with the sword. For Hazor before time was the head of all those kingdoms. And they smote all the souls that were therein with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them. There was not any left to breathe, but he burnt Hazor with fire. And all the cities of those kings and all the kings of them did Joshua take and smote them with the edge of the sword, and he utterly destroyed them, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded. Now, understand this. If you want me to give you a practice, I've given you the most important thing. Stop focusing on the trouble. Stop looking at how big your problems are. Realize nothing's impossible for God, and just find your rest in Him. Lean on Him. Look to Him. Find your comfort in Him. He will bear you through them. The reason why we can have peace is not because of the absence of problems, but because of the presence of God. It's that simple within Christianity. But if you want me to give you a bit of practical advice of how to start working through the problems to keep from getting overwhelmed, Joshua not only looked to God, and you'll find literally in this passage that he found peace and rest in God, but Joshua felt like the best way to deal with this, when he looked up at his problems and they were as big as the sand of the sea, and there's so many of them you can't see an end in sight. Well, he didn't say it's too much. He just went ahead and he picked the biggest one, the one that used to be the leader of all these people, the one that used to be the head of all of this, the one that he knew, if I can put this enemy down, everybody else is going to pale in comparison. And he took that one down. If I can give you a practical principle here, I've already given you the most important part of the message, but a practical thing to help you when you're overwhelmed by your problems, when there's too many of them. Pick the biggest things, the most important things, the things that have to be dealt with, and deal with them. If you don't understand what I'm saying, let me put it like this. Where I used to work at before I left my full-time job and went full-time in ministry, my boss was a great guy, was the best boss I've ever had, or at least one of them. He was, just a tremendous guy to work for, but there's one thing he lacked. and that was, well, there's a lot of things he lacked. Focus is one of them. And he had a problem that anytime the workload started building up, that he would get overwhelmed fast. And this guy's the leader. This guy's the one who's supposed to be keeping all of us focused. And so there I was, and I never got the title of supervisor, but I was supervisor half the time when I worked there. Not the last year maybe, but up until that point, I was the supervisor there. Because what would happen is he would start to get overwhelmed because somebody come and they gave him this job and this job and this job to do. And you would watch him. He'd go over here and work for 5 minutes on this one, and then he would run over there for 5 minutes and work on that one, and then he'd run over there for 5 minutes and work on another one, and over there for 5 minutes. And I would just start thinking, I realized, well, wait a minute. The customer's coming for this one in like 20 minutes. This is the big one. This one has to be done. That one you're working on right now is not due until 2 weeks from now. Leave that alone. So I would point that out to him. He'd come, he'd get this one done, and then he'd feel a little bit less weight on his shoulder because he got the one that's due right now, he got it done. But then he would go back to, okay, I'll work on this one for 5 minutes, this one. So I'd have to get him again. I'd point out the customer's coming for this one in about 3 hours. That's the next one on the list. It's the big job. Get it done, and you'll be okay. He would work on it, he'd get it done, and all of a sudden, next thing you know, he's not even bouncing, he's not even working anymore. He's sitting over here eating a cookie and talking to people because all the stress is off of his shoulders because he got the big things done. The things that had to be dealt with now, he took care of them. There is a principle for you and I that in any part of life, you deal with the big things first, the most important things first. For example, the reason why I can pack more in a car than anyone who's not Romanian in this room. And I'll include Aura as being not Romanian because I can sure outpack her, is because of the fact that I learned a lesson a long time ago. You get the big stuff in. When the big stuff's in, then you can put the next things in. And then little by little, you just fill in the gaps. You want to see that in practice. I've said this many times as an example. You watch Joe, or especially Narchis, he's a master at this. When he packs, you can't fit your hand between two pieces of clothing. It's so tight. It's a master thing. He can do a business of it. But my point is, what did he do? He dealt with the big stuff first. Once he got the big stuff out of the way, the little stuff doesn't seem so big anymore. The only reason why the little stuff seems big is because you're looking at it in this massive sea of problems. But when you take care of the big things, then the little things, well, they're not such a big deal. I mean, I can deal with them. That's not a problem anymore. You get overwhelmed because you're looking at all the problems at one time. So if you want a bit of practical advice, deal with the big stuff first. Make sure you never get your focus off of God. Continue to trust Him and look at Him to get you through it while you take step by step. This is the biggest, most important thing, so I'll deal with this today. I get that done, I'll move on to the next biggest and most important thing. Don't waste time trying to take care of all the little things, but get the big stuff out of the way first. And when you can take that big thing and move it out of the way, and there's all that empty space right there, the problems don't look so big anymore. They don't look so overwhelming anymore. So the practical advice would be that. Now let me see, I think there's probably at least a few more verses I would like to add in before I have to close. Verse 15 says, as the Lord commanded Moses, his servant, so did Moses command Joshua, and so did Joshua. He left nothing undone that the Lord commanded Moses. The other practical advice is I would say that in the situations where you're overwhelmed and you don't know what to do, I'm not talking about that, there's just too many problems and you don't know which one to deal with, but I mean in the sense where you don't know what to do. You don't know where to go, what the next step holds, is take those things that you know God would have you to do, those express commands that God has made to you, and do that which is right, and simply trust God to work the rest out. The fact is, again, if Moses had done that, if Moses had took that practical advice, and he had simply done what he knew God had commanded him to do, and stopped looking at all the people and worrying about who's going to feed them, well, he could trust God to feed them if he just does the things that are actually his job to do. Again, the same thing with my boss. If he would have done his job, because half the time the reason why he was so worried is because he was coming to check to see if I was doing my job, and if that other guy was doing his job, or if that other guy was doing his job. And I understand he's the owner of the company, so there's a sense there where that's his job. But when you've chosen to be the owner of the company and one of the employees on the floor, sometimes you just have to stop worrying about everybody else's job and do yours. You have to simply do what you know you're supposed to do. You have to do that which is right, and just stay focused and stay the course on that and trust God to work out all the details. That's the other bit of practical advice I would bring in this. And then let me also give you verse 18 and 19. And Joshua made war a long time with all those kings. There was not a city that made peace with the children of Israel, save the Hivites, the inhabitants of Gibeon. All other they took in battle. Joshua learned his lesson about the one time he failed, the one time he took it easy, he didn't follow God, and he did it his way with the Gibeonites in that sense of making peace. He learned his lesson from that. And so in this battle, what he learned from his previous failures was do not give up. Don't say that I'll compromise and I'll let this problem go. In fact, let me just put a very special, we'll talk more about this maybe as we go on, but if you are facing so many problems, one of the easiest places you'll fail, and we actually talked about this last Monday, one of the easiest places you'll fail is that you get some things crossed off your list. You finish a few of those overwhelming tasks, and you say, okay, I've worked so hard, that's enough. If you can learn another lesson from Joshua, it's don't give up, finish the task, get them all done, and then rest. Because that's what you see. When he got all the enemies defeated, he didn't make peace with any. There was no compromises. There was no, well, I painted this much of the room. That one corner's not so bad. I'll get that later. And then you forget about it for the next 7 years kind of things. He saw all the battle through. So if you want my Monday night message being, you can take that thought and go back and listen to it. But verse 23 says, so Joshua took the whole land according to all the Lord said unto Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance unto Israel according to their division by their tribes, and the land rested from war. When the battle was finished, because Joshua had kept his focus on God the whole time, they were finally able to settle down, sit down and rest, and they found their rest in the Lord. So there is a very simple principle here that in the battle, after the battle, all through the battle, find your rest in God, keep your focus on Him. And the practical side is deal with the big things first. Don't get overwhelmed. Keep your focus on God. Don't neglect any of it. Just see it through and keep fighting until you're done with it. That's the practical sides of it. The spiritual and most important side is don't look so much at the problems. Keep your focus on God and realize He's the one that can meet the needs and bear you through it. His grace is sufficient. Father, we thank you and praise you, God, for what you do. We thank you for all your blessings. We thank you for how good you are to us. We pray, God, that even though there's always a temptation to be overwhelmed, there's always a list of struggles lining up against us, that, God, you would help us to just take the list and check them off, to go through them and fix the things, but trust you step by step as we do it, to not get overwhelmed, but just rest in you, Lord, and trust your strength to take us through each one, even the ones we can't do in our own ability, Lord, especially the ones we can't do in our own ability, to just trust you and follow you through them. Lord, we thank you for what you do, and we ask it in your Son, Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so I'm going to let Nick close out the live stream, and as he's doing that,